afternoon. I'm Javier Espinoza, EU correspondent with the Financial Times in Brussels now for the last 5 years. And how time flies, and it's a great pleasure, honor to have you all joining online. Hopefully we'll see lots of you in person soon in all the different events of the rentrée, which is every year more intense. And this year particularly, even more so, because we are at the cusp of something new, a lot of excitement over who will be the new commissioner for competition, the new commissioner for digital, new faces, old faces, new issues, old issues. We all come, I hope, refreshed. I still have to confess, I have a bit of a holiday brain, still trying to shake it off, but really keen to start engaging and having conversations and discussions with you. And what a great way to start with over 400 of you that have registered. I'm always keen to hear from you, so we have a chat going. And please go ahead and send your questions. It's very important to feel that we are also communicating with you, even if we cannot hear you and see you. So we actually make the most of the hour that you have reserved to listen to this discussion, which no doubt will be super, super exciting. We are here obviously to talk about tech policy, and we are here more importantly to discuss Werner Stengg's new riveting book out now on digital policy, whose title is Digital Policy in the EU Towards a Human-Centered Digital Transformation. Before I get really into the discussion, it would be good just for my two fellow panelists to say who they are and what they do, and then I'll just set out a bit of the framework of the conversation. So why don't we start with Alexandre?
Yes, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. So I'm Alexandre Streel. I am academic director at CERRE, the think tank on better regulation, and we have a focus on digital. And in that context, we interact a lot with Werner to try to, as much as we can, also strive for this human-centric digital transformation. And I'm also a professor of law at the University of Namur, Sciences Po Paris, and College of Europe.
Fantastic. And Werner, you need no introduction, but go ahead anyway.
Of course I do. Good to see you all, or at least see you in the list of participants. So I'm Werner, I'm Austrian by nationality. I'm a digital dinosaur. Been with the Commission for the last, 28 years. So I'm beating you on this, Javier. Working on digital really since 2011 in various functions. In the last 4.5 years, I was the digital expert to Margrethe Vestager, who is the executive vice president that was asked to make Europe fit for the digital age. And I did my bit to help her with that.
I think that you did more than your bit. And it's fair to say that if you want to hear directly from one of the leading brains that had been shaping, not just in the last 5 years, but I think, decades back, as you were saying, Werner, the digital path of the continent of Europe and its effects in other jurisdictions, we have the right person here. So please do send your questions. I just want to read from your extensive work, just, to get us going, because what is it that we're talking about here? So just to pull ourselves back and understand what we're discussing and why. There's just a fragment of your book that I really enjoyed. It says, the internet has changed our lives and big tech has changed our internet. The single most important impact of the internet has been the empowerment of its users, granting everyone easy access to information and knowledge. Today's digital champions have obtained their current strength because they managed to offer us convenience on top of information. We accepted the bargain to trade our personal identities in exchange for their satisfying our needs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, As a result of this bargain, big tech companies have turned into powerful gatekeepers, exercising decisive influence over the fate of their citizens, other companies, and entire democracies. And I just thought that this really encapsulates why we are here, why we have digital policy, why we need it, because as I keep living more years in this life, I just noticed that technology, which was supposed to free me, it's actually enslaving me more. I mean, maybe this is a bit of a dramatic statement, but I hope you know what I mean. And so, Werner, just tell us what, from this fragment of your book, a bit about the genesis and the idea. Why this book? Why now?
Yeah, well, probably it even started with young people, because I said I'm a dinosaur, which also means that I have, obviously, like you guys, known a world without digital. So when I came to Brussels in '96, we didn't have any of that stuff, right? There was not even search, there was no real internet with content. There were no app stores and no platforms and no social media and no mobile phones and none of that, right? And if you have gone through that, you of course understand much better what has changed in the meantime, right? And sometimes I have visitor groups here, or quite often actually, coming to the commission, and often a room filled with students. And I was supposed to tell them in 1 hour what it takes to make Europe fit for the digital age. And then I realized I could not possibly start with our laws and say, well, and the gatekeeper regulation here and social media regulation there. So I had to go one step back and another step back and actually take them a bit with me through this journey of the opportunities and risks that have arisen in those last 25 years. And from there, it was a small step to think, actually, I could put that also in the form of a book, which also allowed me in a way to download mentally all that stuff that I have been accumulating over the years, right? You learn something new and you make a nice chart, you present something there. And so in a way, this was for me, also, before I get too old and forget everything that I've done, put it all down in the hope that especially young readers would find it informative.
Very interesting. And I'm still putting myself on mute even many years after COVID, so I apologize. So tell me a bit about the process. I was curious, we chatted about it, like how extensive, what was your routine? How difficult was it to write? As somebody who works in the world of words, I'm always interested in this process.
Yeah, it was a lot of work, to be honest. Yeah, it took me 1.5 years basically to write it. At the beginning, I thought it would be much easier because I had a clear idea of what I would tell. I had my own charts and other things that I prepared over the years. But then you start writing a chapter and you find out, okay, you can't be so superficial. You have to back it up. And I'm a writer also. I also write other books and also fiction books, right? So once I start writing, I get carried away. And so I realized every chapter where I thought I would just need 3 days, I needed 3 weeks. And that is not easy if you have a full-time job, the way I just had this one here, and kids at home with whom I love to spend time. So I was actually, of course, every weekend and every holiday anyway, but often on a weekend, I woke up at 5 and I said to myself, oh my God, if I get up now, I have 3 or 4 hours before the kids are up. And so I went down in the dark living room, but I was so determined to do that I never felt any self-pity. It was just super satisfying, but still a lot of work.
Wow, that is dedication. Alexandre, some big sweeping thoughts or something key from the book that caught your attention before we get into the meat of this discussion, which we want to structure in the last 20 years, the last 5, and then the future?
Yeah, I mean, I really like this book because it's someone who was in the machine room, and too often, in the academic community, people fantasize about things, and I think we have here an explanation from someone who was really one of the writer of all those laws of why and what it has been done. No, I think it's important if also we want to understand where we are going, and some questions are coming, and thanks for that on the next mandate, you know, what will be done. And I think that's very important, and that was in the mind of many people. But I think what this book helped us to predict the future is to understand why those recent laws have been done. What are their DNA, if we want, and from that, what we can expect from the next mandate. So I really recommend everyone who wants to know what will happen in the next mandate to read that book, because I think, you know, the von der Leyen I Commission really set up the DNA for a framework which will probably last over 20 years. And I'm really thankful to Werner to have take time to do that, because we know that all of those people at the Commission at that kind of position are extremely busy, and it's really a collective good that you give us, Werner.
Yes, and Werner, tell us about the genesis of what Alexandre is talking about here. You discussed, you know, we talk about the DNA and the digital policy of the EU going forward, but where are we coming from? You described this world where we didn't have any technology, you know, and no WhatsApp and no instant messaging, which seems quite a bizarre idea to imagine today.
Indeed, and actually the book is structured in the same way, because first I'm sort of explaining how the internet has evolved and changed over the years. And I sort of stop at 2019 when von der Leyen and Margrethe Vestager took over. Up until then, all those changes also led to some policy responses, obviously, but it was always a bit piecemeal and reactive. And I call it a bit of a paradigm shift, that this new digital policy really made a difference. Now, in those first years, well, we all, not all of us, but many of us do remember that the internet as such actually was a very decentralized democratic tool in a way. It was almost archaic, and there were no rules, and it meant a bit everybody had a chance to see everything on the internet. But of course, it was not easy to find something on the internet, because there was not, first of all, there was not much on the internet at the turn of the millennium, but also there was no search engines worth of that name. So if the little that was there you couldn't find, then search became much better. Then a few years later, we had mobile phones, and the whole internet went mobile, and with that, the app economy developed. And then gradually, the first social media companies came, and the first marketplaces, online platforms came. And that was, at that time, a very good thing, because they were the matchmakers. They organized the internet for us, because that hadn't existed in the past, right? You Googled, as to the extent that Google was already better developed, you Googled for a hotel in Portugal, but then you got an endless list without any prioritization. And then came those platforms and put all that content into nice drawers. Yeah, either you want to buy a product, or you want to rent a hotel, or you want to search, or you want to do this, that, or the other. And the internet became accessible in a way to all of us through those intermediaries, through those platforms. Super matchmakers, suppliers find buyers. So that was great. I'm an economist, so in efficiency terms, of course, this was great. And many small companies all of a sudden were able to reach consumers and users all over the world, where probably before that they would just send in their own country or to the neighboring country speaking the same language. But then this online platform evolution was, of course, also the game changer, because by organizing the internet for us, they also created their own markets, which they themselves defined and controlled, and they decide who has access to this market, on what terms. And so they've a bit compartmentalized the internet, so it became much more centralized compared to the original vocation of a super open, decentralized democratic internet. Then, of course, they started to make money with this, and using mainly our personal data, obviously, to fuel their business, except for the commissions that their sellers would of course, pay to them. So the whole advertising ecosystem was created. And so they become, with all the data that they owned and collected and kept for themselves, they became, of course, every year they became much stronger than the year before. And then many of them started also not just offering that marketplace to third parties, but they became players in their own right. And then Amazon began to, well, actually, they started as a retailer and then admitted the marketplace, but for others, it was the other way around. So all of a sudden, those market makers, those private market makers, started to compete with those others that depended on their marketplace. So this was really sort of the game changer, which led to this systemic relevance of those platforms because they turned into quasi monopolists, oligopolists. And with that role and with that power, they started to determine the fate of each and every one of us. So what information would you, Javier, or myself see or not see? What product will be pushed to us or not? What advertisement? So the success of companies and the fate of citizens, all of a sudden, we found ourselves in the hand of a small group of very good, and so it's not all bad, yeah, good operators, but getting total control over the internet as we knew it, and actually almost doing away with the internet that we knew.
This, as you were retelling this story, and it's really interesting just to remind ourselves where we come from. I was wondering, do you think we were very naive at the beginning? Was there a before and after moment or some catalysts? I'm thinking, you know, we had the Cambridge Analytica, and I felt that, to me, that was a kind of like a wake-up moment from naivete to realism.
Exactly, and there were some wake-up calls which actually culminated in what I call the paradigm shift. Because at the beginning, I don't know whether we were naive. At the beginning, it was just the opportunities so clearly outweighed any potential downsides, right? Because all of a sudden, as I said, as citizen, you could buy stuff everywhere and had a lot of choice and so on. Those platforms offered a lot of convenience to us. Now with the mobile phone, of course, every need that we may have, we can satisfy, as I said, 24/7, 7 days a week. So there's so much in it for us as consumers. And at the beginning, we just cashed it in and said, oh, wonderful. And if people that at the early days, they also became aware a bit of their data maybe somehow at stake. But I still remember many people saying, oh my God, I've got nothing to hide. Or it's a fair deal. You know, I get these wonderful services for free. So they can do something with my data. I have nothing to hide. I'm not a criminal, right? And from company perspective also, at the beginning, it was much more the enabling part. Yeah? When I refer to SMEs that may not have been able to sell outside their own jurisdictions, and all of a sudden jumping on the bandwagon of platforms, of marketplaces, they could expand all over Europe and beyond. So it was only over the years, I think, and that came with this increasing market power of those platforms, that all of a sudden, both from a citizen point of view, from a business point of view, but also from a societal point of view, people all of a sudden got scared. And when, you know, when they talk about how was Brexit influenced, was the first Trump election a result of this, down to the Cambridge Analytica scandals and Francis Haugen, the whistleblower of Facebook, but also the market power led to a situation where more and more companies said, oh my God, I mean, I'm totally dependent on companies that don't necessarily treat me well anymore, or that hold it in their own hands whether I have a fair chance to get to the market to find my customers. So I don't think we were naive. It is just things evolved in a way that probably nobody really was able to predict just 15 to 10 years ago.
Okay. And maybe, Alexandre, from your perspective, anything to add on this sort of journey of digital transformation from, you know,
yes,
the before and after?
Maybe two points. I mean, Werner was mentioning at the beginning that he joined the Commission in '96, and that is also the year where John Perry Barlow had this very important declaration on the Declaration of the Independence of the Cyberspace, where, I mean, his main plea was to say, leave us alone. It was not, we were not calling platform at the time, but internet company, we would create a better world. And I think there was a bit of naivety. I'm not sure that in Europe we really believe that, but there is, you know, this whole libertarian philosophy that is coming from California and still there to some extent, which is present, and which to me at least is a bit naive, because it creates different risk for the economy and the society, as Werner has mentioned. And I think the whole thing and the whole evolution of the thinking has to be we have to maximize the opportunity that the platform have lead to us, that Werner was mentioning, and minimize the risk. And I think that's what the paradigm shift in a way went, is to understand that there is a risk to be minimized. Risk for the economy, risk for the society, risk for Europe, because I mean there is a geopolitical issue there too. I mean we should not deny that. The fact is that Europe missed this first, let's say, digital transformation, and that of course has increased the risk for us compared to other regions of the world, and justify, I think, a stronger reaction. And also, and probably the biggest risk I see, is risk for our value. You know, because we often mention the Brussels effect very proudly, that we are the best at regulating and everyone is copying us. And in a way, it's partly true. I think it's over-exaggerated often, but it's partly true. But there is another effect, which to me is even bigger, is the Silicon Valley effect, you know, because those platforms have in a way transformed or wanted to transform our value. And I think there, we should recognize that in Europe, we have different value than the one in California. For instance, we balance different fundamental rights, I think, in a different way than free speech above everything else. And the question is, do we accept of having this change of value? Or on the other hand, do we say, no, I mean, we have an history since the Enlightenment which had lost to those kind of value, and they are at risk, I think. And I think that's also the biggest risk I see, and why I think there was also this paradigm shift was so powerful and so rapid. I think no one among the three of us, and probably in the audience, could have thought at the beginning of the von der Leyen One Commission that we will be here today. I'm not sure. I mean, it's also thanks to the hard work of Werner, but I mean, my impression is that nobody had expected that it will be so quick and that we will have so many consensus around the parliament, the commission, the population to do things. And I think it's because we probably understood that some of our value were at risk.
Very good. I'm mindful of time, and I think it would be good. We are reflecting of the past, but I think people are also hungry to get some insights into what the future holds. And so with that in mind, take us through, Werner. I'm interested to hear from you. What was the thinking, the conversations happening around, you know, at the beginning of this commission, and how did it play out? Because I know that you had very, very key roles in, you know, DSA, DMA, but also you were spending all these long hours in the trialogues, these record-breaking trialogues of the AI Act. So tell us, what's your assessment now that we have the full 5 years?
Absolutely. And I think you're only covering part of the picture by referring to all this legislation, because making Europe fit for the digital age, as envisaged by von der Leyen, was much more than that. And that's also why my book is not, you know, I just have to look at my book, it's not digital legislation in the EU, it's digital policy in the EU, but then still towards a human-centered digital transformation. What does it mean? When we started thinking in this building about what it takes to make Europe fit for the digital age, it was really two objectives that are closely linked. The one, and probably even the most important one, was to, as the name suggests, to make Europe fit for the digital age, to strengthen Europe, to strengthen Europe's ability to ourselves use and develop digital tools. But the way we would do that, as Alexandre rightly said, was meant to be in tune with our values, with our ethical norms, with our society as we know it, right? So it was not to develop capacities and technologies no matter what, but always having people in mind, right? Technology to serve people, not the other way around. That's one of the things that Margrethe Vestager said very often at the beginning of this term. So yes, we want to develop digital policy and technology in Europe, but in the European way. Now that took two things. On the one hand, a massive investment program, and this is also part of my book, and it's sometimes forgotten because when people look at Brussels, They just think, oh my God, these guys are regulating again, and they just get excited when they create another Brussels effect, which is also fun, yeah, sure. But it was not the only one, right? The other one was, okay, what does it take for Europe to become a more credible player in the global digital world, next to the US, next to China? You referred to this yourself, Alexandre, I think, when you said we have lost the battle in the first wave of digital transformation. And this was the consumer-facing internet, right? The one we just discussed up until now. All those platforms that offer content, product, services, whatever to us, and have done so very successfully based on their advertising model mainly. But what we say when we say Europe fit for the digital age, we have a different transformation in mind. It's much more industrial policy than just purely digital policy. So because where is today, where is productivity coming from? Where is innovation coming from? That's not by creating another social media platform. It is by using digital technologies in the industrial space, right? All our companies, all types of companies, all types of sectors, if they were able to use data, and many of which would be totally non-personal data, if they were able to use that data and use artificial intelligence to make sense of this data, we would be the new powerhouse developing tomorrow's solutions. So that was an important part of this, of the narrative of making Europe fit for the digital age. At the same time, of course, we said we need to address the problems and risks we have been talking about so far, right? So on the one hand, protect citizens and the internet as such from various abuses, from privacy to discrimination to whatever it is, but also to empower our companies to have a fair chance on the market. Because if there's market power held by a happy few, and they hold it in their hands, whether any of our startups or scale-ups will be successful, well, then we needed to do something about this, right? So the legislation is there to give opportunities to everyone out there, to make this internet again available and accessible to everyone. So it's the legislative part, but it's also the investment part. And as I said, the second thing was it's not just digital anymore, it is everywhere. Since digital is so transversal, we already started by saying there's a twin transition, digital and green, from the very beginning of this mandate, because many of the efficiency gains that you would need in the green transformation would again come from the intelligent use of data and AI. So that's what AI is here for. Yeah? AI is meant to help us take better decisions by analyzing data in a way that no human could ever do. But the purpose was actually green and not digital in its own right. And equally, industrial policy, we have always, one of the strengths of Europe traditionally had been our industrial fabric. We have world-leading companies out there, traditional industrialized companies. So, and there for the next stage of their development, we also want them to be able to tap into the digital world. So that's one also argument in my book. The boundaries are getting increasingly blurred. And the third, if I may, more fundamental issue was the democratic principles. Because the problem of a few gatekeepers holding the key to the internet was also that they would define the rules. But still, with their workings, would affect each and every one of us. So we felt, oh my God, have we somehow lost total control over our lives, of our citizens, of our companies, of our democracies, by sort of outsourcing it involuntarily to the algorithms held by a few private companies. So we said, no, we need to discuss all these trade-offs, and there are many trade-offs in this field, in a democratically justified way. And we may not never have the right solution or the perfect solution, but we prefer that it's the citizens ultimately who decide on those trade-offs, and not someone sitting in Silicon Valley trying to maximize their profits.
As an aside, but directly related to this, we talked about the EU missing the first digital transformation. Do you think, both Werner and Alexandre, that the EU is already losing the second? Or I don't know if we're can even call it a third digital transformation. It depends how you define a digital transformation. But AI, I'm thinking, if you look at the incumbents, they are the ones cornering the market. It's the same names that we saw in the last 2 decades, getting all the wins from the AI race, whether it's a hype or not, that may be a subset of a question.
Well, if I may start, and Alexandre, then please feel free to come in. There is, of course, this risk because, as you rightly said, the incumbents, the current gatekeepers, of course, have everything it takes to be successful now on AI. And it's not just the hypothesis, we all know this, right? I mean, from all the big foundational models, many of them are within those gatekeepers, are closely associated with them simply because they have the know-how, they have the cloud capabilities, they have the computing power, they have everything it takes to be the front runners there. So that's on a company level. And on a country level, if you take again AI, of course, we knew how much more the US and China invested in AI than we had ever been able to do. I would argue the risk, of course, we can discuss this further in this conversation. The risk will always be there, but without our new industrial/digital policy that we started a few years ago, we would definitely have lost this battle. So I think as an optimist, I would say, if we continue on this path, and I know that von der Leyen wants to do that in the next mandate, then at least we have a chance to catch up, or also to use our own assets as an advantage. We're not lagging behind everywhere. We're fantastic in research and innovation, but then we have difficulty getting this to the market, or our startups need capital from the US because we have a lousy capital market here in Europe. So we have strengths, as I said, also our industrial fabric. We are great in areas like robotics. We are fantastic, by the way, when it comes to supercomputing. We have, with our high-performance computing network all over Europe, we now have 4 of the world's most powerful supercomputers. So it is not that we are lagging behind everywhere, but it needs a collective effort, of course, to get to where we want to be. But Alexandre, I'm speaking too much.
No, but I mean, I think that will be the challenge of this commission. And in a way, the last commission has done the easiest work. I mean, it was indispensable, but it was the easiest task, is to adopt a new law and to start an industrial policy. But I must say that if you take AI, I mean, we know what are the innovation capability that are needed. Those are brain, long-term finance, chips, cloud, and data. Okay. Now, the question is, Europe is lagging behind on those element mostly. What the regulation which has been adopted during the von der Leyen I Commission has aimed to achieve is to open those innovation capabilities. The question is whether the enforcement will manage to get to it. I hope so, and I think the Commission is well placed to do it, surely better placed than a national authority to do it. So I think it was good to give many enforcement power to the Commission. But that's not enough to open them up. I mean, we have to develop ourselves those capabilities if we don't want to be to lag behind. And it has become a geopolitical priority. So we need more brains, so that is changing our migration policy. We need more finance, as Werner was mentioning. This is changing our capital market. We need chips. I mean, we have started, but clearly I don't think it's enough. We need cloud and we need data. And so the thing is, what worries me is that Europe is very good at adopting law and relatively good at enforcing them, because it has done it since 70 years. But to have an industrial policy where you develop innovation capabilities at the European level, not at the national level, at the European level, this is very new for Europe, you know. And the second thing I wanted to say is that it's often linked to the defense policy, because we know that a lot of those applications are dual use, you know. So I think it's very, very important also for digital that we manage to develop a very ambitious defense policy. So I was happy to see that in the political orientation of von der Leyen, that she pushed a lot on defense and industrial policy. But at this stage, this is just a speech, you know. And the problem we all know is whether we will have whether the national leader in particular will have the willingness to do so. Because, you know, you remember on this famous sentence of Juncker. He said, we know what to do, but we don't know how to be re-elected with this. And I think this is the same, if we take migration. I mean, I think, many people want to move to Europe because the quality of life is in a way better than in the US, but it's just that it's impossible. It's very difficult. So I think, it's much beyond, if we want to manage and not to lag behind, it's much beyond what we are discussing now. I mean, it's a combination of an industrial policy that we need to really to try to not only open those innovation capability which are needed for AI, but also to develop it ourselves.
Noted.
Sorry, Werner, I saw you nodding. I don't know if you want to come back.
If I may just very briefly, because I would challenge you, Alexandre, to some extent, because we have started a lot of this work in this commission as well. I know it's not enough, and we have to still to see whether all this work bears fruit. But if you just take the Digital Decade policy program for Brussels insiders, I mean, this was sort of the manifestation of our determination as Europe to invest in all these technologies that you mentioned, right? From chips to cloud to connectivity to computing power to what have you. But this was not just empty words. This is a program that set out very clear targets for 2030, where we want to be in those areas. There's very, very tight monitoring on a yearly basis to see where member states are on this. But there's also a lot of money that was already going into this and will be going into this. So it's not just policy, right? And there, to some extent, we were helped by COVID. So if COVID did anything good, it was that Europe got its huge program out of this, where we said we spent collectively, what was it, 750 billion euros to get our countries out of the crisis and into the future. And in contrast to what we had done in the financial crisis of 2007-8, when a lot of money was poured in to reestablish the previous status, we said, well, if so much taxpayers and other people's money is used, we need to invest money in the future. And that meant into green and into digital. This, together with some specific community programs, meant that a lot of money is actually, I can prove that, is actually going into all these areas. Yeah. Will it be enough? Will it be fast enough? Of course, I don't know. But also the data strategy, because there was a question actually here about von der Leyen's European Data Union strategy that she announced here. I mean, this is also an example of continuation. Because when I was saying there was a paradigm shift in 2019, that was true. Now I would argue there's a lot of continuity between von der Leyen 1 and von der Leyen 2. We had a data strategy at the very beginning of the first mandate, right? And one of the examples there was we want to create data spaces, European data spaces in many different areas, exactly because, Alexandre, you said we need data, of course, for AI to be successful. And we started creating those. We're not done yet, yeah? But for instance, we agreed on this regulation on the European health data space. This has immense potential, yeah, in terms of societal good, but also innovations and competitiveness. Prior to that framework, which of course still has to enter into force, prior to this framework, it was impossible for European companies or researchers to gather health data from all over Europe because much too sensitive, and GDPR-related issues and fears and cyber risks, what have you. So we have also already started creating those data spaces, but von der Leyen is perfectly right. If that has to become even more central to our industrial policy, we need to take these 2 steps forward, yeah? But we are building on things that are going on already.
Brilliant. And I see questions coming through, which is excellent. And we're about 20 minutes left in this conversation. So let's now move to the future and what we think is going to happen. Obviously, Werner, you are in the machine and in the thinking process, and I'm sure you're having conversations about, preparing the next commission for the next 5 years. So take us inside the conversations that you're having with people right now.
Well, I think I don't have to improvise that much because you just have to read the guidelines of the new president. Because I often got these questions, of course, from people and stakeholders. So, oh my God, what are you doing now? You have done so much legislation. As I said, the focus is always on that. We need a break. We need to digest this. We need to implement it. We need to enforce it. Please don't come up with the next generation of big digital laws. But this is not what you will find in the von der Leyen's program. You will, however, find, first of all, that she makes prosperity and competitiveness as the first and biggest objective. That is also important, right? Including defense and what have you. But competitiveness is certainly very high up on the list, right? There you find everything from making the single market work better and deepen it, from telecommunications to energy to services to finance, things like capital markets, research and innovation. But one very specific says we need to boost productivity with digital tech diffusion. The idea here clearly is that with all the things that we have done now, regulatory and investment wise, and we keep doing, the purpose is, of course, that our companies, our industries start really integrating this into their core business, right? And this requires an effort. And here I agree with Alexandre that legislating is probably easier than bringing about this huge change in the fabrics of companies, small and large. Yeah. When we say to small and medium-sized business, you have to use data and extract value from data by using AI. That's not easy for an SME. And these guys are probably busy just getting through with their day job and pushing services to their customers. So for large organizations, maybe easier, but still. So what does she say von der Leyen? She says, first, of course, implementation and enforcement. It's a core priority when it comes to the digital laws that we just adopted, right? DSA, DMA, AI Act. Because if we don't implement them, if they're not complied with, if we don't enforce them, then this was worth nothing. So obviously that's the starting point. Also because this legal framework is not just there to protect people, it's also important, but it's also meant to provide a legal framework for companies to get on with it. Because in spite of all the discussions about the AI Act and whether we found the right balance between innovation and regulation, it does create a homogeneous framework all over Europe. It gives the legal certainty and predictability for any company out there, right? If you comply, you have access to 450 million consumers. So in that sense, legislation is also meant to help productivity and growth, if you want, right? But then, of course, she also says we need to step up investment in frontier technologies. And that's, again, building on what we have already done under the Digital Decade Program, which runs until 2030 anyway, right to the end of the next mandate. So it's everything from, Alexandre, you mentioned chips, semiconductors. Yes, we will never produce all the semiconductors that we need, but we are already much better placed today than we were 3 years ago, and we will be even better placed in 5 years from now, but also not doing it on our own, but also in close cooperation with our international partners whom we consider like-minded partners. So we've been discussing with the US for years now in the TTC, but we're also having dialogues, of course, with many other jurisdictions. So nobody wants to close in and say, now Europe, for instance, need to be able to produce everything by ourselves. This would be economic nonsense. We just need to manage dependencies. We need to manage vulnerabilities, but we also want open and fair trade. And also von der Leyen is very strong on that. So Europe has its strength from being an exporting continent, right? So we want open markets. We want collaboration with our partners. So there is a lot of stuff in the guidelines that answer your question. She also mentioned AI, by the way, very specifically. And there, as a good example, I think we created that idea a few months ago, and this will now be accelerated. Those AI factories, which for us is sort of not mini Silicon Valleys, but the idea is that we build on our supercomputers that I mentioned already. We have currently 10, there will soon be 15 and more, where we want to create ecosystems, bringing together computing power, data, skills, which are, of course, needed, cloud, and make this available to not only researchers, but also to promising startups and scale-ups. So this is exactly the task ahead. We've created sort of framework conditions and guardrails. Now we have to make sure that the opportunities that have been created and will be created will actually be exploited by our researchers and companies.
That's a really good point, Werner. But the cynic in me, not the journalists, tend to be cynical. Things that regulators are going to regulate. So surely we will see new acts or new proposals, for example, on telecoms. Or, can you give us a little bit of flavor of what sort of, I don't know if we're going to stick with the word act in the next term or bill or whatever, but just something concrete that we might see?
First of all, I'm not naive. You may be cynical, I'm not naive. I've been here, as I said, for quite a while, and of course, no commission just continues the work of the previous one and says, well, that's all that needed to be done, let's just implement. So there will inevitably be some new acts here or there. What I do not expect is an avalanche. There may be some fixing of problems that have not been fixed yet. And when you refer to telecoms, I mean, it is not because we need to regulate telecoms. The starting point of the white paper, which is currently out there, right, and which will lead to some follow-up inevitably, this was about the needs that we have in terms of infrastructure and connectivity. So it was not a problem like in the past when we said, well, gatekeepers abuse their market power, so therefore we need to regulate this. Here we are asking the question, does Europe have the connectivity that it needs to do all those wonderful things that we dream of, for our companies and researchers? So therefore, this is a very different type of animal, if you want, right?
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Alexandre, what do you think should be the flavor of the next 5 years?
Yeah, so at CERRE, with the academic team of CERRE, we have produced a white paper for the next commission, where we bring some idea of what we think should be good for next commission. One of these is, if we focus on regulation, I think, as Werner was saying, it's very important that it is implemented in an effective, proportionate and independent way. And here, I mean, clearly, we will see a tension more and more between the Commission as a geopolitical body, as the government of Europe in a world which is more and more difficult to navigate with, and the Commission as an independent regulator. And, I'm wondering myself whether these two roles will be not more and more in tension, and at some point, sometime we would need to establish an independent EU digital regulatory agency at some point. The second thing I see is that it will be very important to have a robust and independent evaluation of all those laws. Because clearly, I mean, we make mistakes. I mean, it's inevitable, in particular in such a complex environment and new environment, that mistakes are made by the legislator. And it will be very important that quickly those mistakes are corrected. And the problem I see is that that's not what Europe or a national government is good at. When you have a law, you always seem to say it's a very good law, so if it doesn't work, we just have to double down. And I can take the example of the GDPR, which I think has a lot of perverse effect, and some are mentioned in the chat, in the question, in the sense that it is not very good for very small company, and it may have killed some innovation in Europe because of that, because the GDPR was not asymmetric enough, if I could say so. So, I don't think it's the case for the DSA and the DMA, which are much more asymmetric, but we may see other problem, and the story of the GDPR, I think, is that we recognize mistake, and adapting our law. So I hope that the feedback loop, if you want, will be much quicker. And then that's for regulation. And then, as we discussed, I think we would need to develop a much more ambitious industrial policy, which is offensive in the sense that it is about encouraging innovator and not defensive. Not either protecting the loser of the digital revolution or picking some winner. Okay, so I think that is very important. And again, Werner, you were mentioning, and I agree with you, that some progress have been made in terms of budget, in terms of monitoring those targets. But the problem so far is that Europe has been notoriously very bad at this. The way the regional fund has been spent is a disaster, I would say. The way we have this plan since, you remember, the Lisbon strategy of 2000, and I mean, we didn't get it at all. So, I agree that we have made some progress, but the problem is that we are not good at it so far. So really, I think it would need a paradigm shift within the Commission, to completely change the mind. And I agree that some progress have been done so far, but I would say not enough. And I think that this commission will really have to change his paradigm even more on the industrial policy than the von der Leyen one commission.
And mindful of the time, I just let Werner reply to what Alexandre say. Then we'll talk about the geopolitics of everything that we discussed, and I'll have time for one or two questions, which keep coming. Thank you very much.
That's fine, but I'm also in parallel reading through questions and try to integrate some of the elements.
Excellent.
But first of all, Alexandre, of course, it's not enough, and we're not there yet, so nobody doubts that. And we just, a few months ago or 2 months ago, we issued sort of the annual progress report on where we are towards the digital decade. The main finding is not fast enough, not good enough. We need to do more. Yeah. The thing is just that at least there is now this determination to do this in a different way. You mentioned some interesting precedents. Yeah, Lisbon strategy. We also knew why it failed, which is why when we devised the digital decade policy program, we tried to do it better this time around. Yeah, with much clearer objectives, with much clearer processes to get there, to take corrective measures if we are not on track. So I'm just saying we try to learn also from those institutional mistakes. GDPR. We also tried to embed some lessons when we created the DSA and other pieces of law. And one consequence of this is the centralized enforcement that you were referring to, right? Which has also become very important because our counterparts, when we talk about very large platforms, when we talk about gatekeepers, they're of course very large entities that operate on a global scale and certainly all over Europe. So in that sense, decentralized enforcement would not make any sense. So the Commission has stepped in and will do that. One point that you mentioned on whether there will be evaluations and reviews and so on, well, first of all, that is part of any law. But I would argue that the new breed of laws, especially DSA and Artificial Intelligence Act, have so much inbuilt flexibility that they don't have to be changed so often. And that's why we did it like that. Because in a good old or bad old world, we had a law which was highly prescriptive. Company X had to do ABC. And then, of course, 3 years later, that may have been overtaken by events and no longer relevant. What these laws do, actually, they are much more principle-based. We spell out objectives. We spell out risks that need to be mitigated. Yeah, like a very large online platform has to mitigate the risks arising to minors. But we are not saying, and these are the 10 measures you have to take, because tomorrow there may be different risks arising to minors, and there may be better ways of addressing those. But these legal frameworks are principle-based, in cooperation also with the industry and experts out there, where we can do codes of conduct, and then we could every year, if you want, update a code of conduct, which then says, well, given the fast evolution of artificial intelligence, there's now a totally new world out there and new mitigation measures where we can update that in parallel, and we don't have to go back for 2 years to the co-legislator. So I hope that at least some part of this issue that you mentioned was addressed by the very design of our new framework.
Can we, after all this discussion, the past, the long past, the distant past, the recent past, and the future, can we frame just some comment on digital policy linked to the geopolitical dimension? I, for one, experienced and heightened, I've never had more front pages than during the COVID time, when we realized that we were highly dependent on technology, but then it seemed to digital policy kind of gone to a second or third tier level of importance because of the war and another war and another war and energy crisis. So Werner, is digital policy becoming increasingly more irrelevant, and who cares?
Absolutely not, I would argue. Because digital is part of the geopolitical issues that we're confronted with, right? Again, there were major shifts in this mandate, of course. Yeah? At the beginning of this mandate, before COVID, before the war, before all this discussion with China heated up and so on, von der Leyen already referred to technological sovereignty that we were looking for, but that meant in a way that we have to be able to do these things ourselves so that we can also control them a bit, and it's good for our competitiveness sake, and we can preserve our values. but there were not so much talk about dependencies, resilience, vulnerabilities. And if you look into those issues, they all have a strong digital dimension, right? During COVID, the first dependency issue after health equipment, of course, was microprocessors, right? We didn't have any chips anymore in Europe to even produce cars in Germany because our suppliers from Asia needed them for video games, yeah? So that was really sort of the dependencies. I'm not even speaking of rare earths and other things. Then the vulnerabilities, all the cyber attacks coming from Russia, all the attempts to destabilize our democracies by feeding us fake news and manipulating the public opinion, down to Africa, when African countries were made believe that it's Europe's fault that there comes no grain from Ukraine, as if it was not the fault of Putin, right? So vulnerabilities also in terms of dependencies on, I don't know, equipment in connectivity networks, right? So there's a lot of those geopolitical issues where digital is absolutely at the forefront. There are other issues as well, but digital is almost everywhere.
Alexandre, some quick words and see if we can pick up a question, but I have seen that Werner and yourself have tried to incorporate some of it. Thank you.
I mean,
all the questions that we received.
I agree with Werner, and I think that's one of the important message of his book, I think, is that digital is geopolitics, you know, and that is one of the element of the paradigm shift that he has mentioned. So yes, I think that digital being everywhere, it's inevitably geopolitics. And the question is how Europe will behave, you know. Will it be just aligned with America as the Atlantis one, or will we have this kind of middle force between the US and China? I think that's the big question of how we will behave in the geopolitical world. But in any case, we need our own resources if we want to play any role in that.
Werner, one question from Victoria de Posson from EUTA. How will the Commission help companies specifically? I speak with a lot of businesses and you too, who usually complain about too much red tape and not enough to do with innovation. How do we answer that? It seems to be like businesses' main pain.
Well, I think, Victoria, in your question, you already partially give an answer. So because first and foremost, since you referred to completing the single market, this is our biggest asset. And if a company wants to be successful in Europe, it needs a functioning single market. This is where also von der Leyen mentions this very early in her paper, and in domains even that are currently not so well covered, because that's what we need. We also need, as I mentioned before, at last this capital markets in Europe, because so many good startups still have to go to the US for venture capital or risk capital, because we have such a traditional capital market here. This would be an absolute game changer if member states were willing to take this one step further. You also mentioned, Victoria, reducing administrative burden on new tech companies, also coming prominently in von der Leyen's program. So going through existing legislation, trying for potential to simplify it, probably to drop some rules. So I think she and the whole Commission are acutely aware that this is what needs to be prioritized in the way forward.
Werner, Brazil banned X recently. Do you think the EU should be in the business of banning platforms? We've seen the animosity between Musk and the Commission, and
First, starting with Brazil, because I went there with my boss 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago, and like many other jurisdictions out there, they're facing exactly the same problems, whether it's market power related or social media related. Whether you talk to Canadians, Australians, Brazilians, Indians, Japanese, South Koreans, British, everybody faces the same problem. And that's where the Brussels effect is a bit there. And they were discussing with us what they should do. But then many of those jurisdictions are saying, well, we're not sure that whether we have the clout to do the same thing that you are doing in Europe. And of course, our clout is, again, that we have 450 million on average wealthy customers. That makes us a credible negotiating partner, if there was a negotiation, with even the largest companies on the world. Now, X and the Commission, it's rather X and the Digital Services Act, because that's all that is happening, right? We have started enforcement work with many of the very large online platforms under the DSA. We are in dialogues with them. For some of them, we have open proceedings because there's suspicion that they do not comply at this stage with our law. I know the colleagues, as you know, very well who are doing this. There is absolute due process, going by the book, going by the rules. Whatever the DSA requires, we are trying to enforce, not more and not less. That's not just a question of ethics and not even a question of independence, Alexandre. It's also one for legal certainty in a way, both for the companies, but also for us, right? If we, for political reasons, were to say, oh, now we set an example and do this, that, or the other, of course, companies will take us to court and say, these guys were not truthfully enforcing the legal framework. So it's due process. If X complies, it's fine. If it not complies, then the next steps of the toolkit will be used.
So, and if I remember correctly, Werner, you know the DSA better than I do, it does allow in the law for banning platforms in the ultimate instance if they repeatedly break the law or seem to be breaking the law, which seems to be the path that Musk is taking.
Well, there are several steps, of course, in the enforcement toolkit, and prior to that, there could already be fines, for instance. Yeah, I mean, you're referring to the nuclear weapon that is indeed in the law. So if one of those systemically relevant platforms were to consistently not comply, but in a serious manner, you know, it's not just you consistently do not grant access to researchers, which would also be bad, right? But I mean, it would have to be persistent and very serious, then one could, at a limit, turn to telcos and say, well, disable access for a given time. So there's lots of checks and balances in there, as always in due process. But yes, in principle, that option exists.
Excellent. Okay, I'm afraid that we've run out of time and not out of ideas, thankfully, and discussions. Thank you for all your questions. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for the people who are slowly, now I see, dropping off, and the interest. And I hope that we can continue this conversation offline, obviously, with not technology between us, but only goodwill to continue to flesh this out. Thank you so much. Thank you, Alexandre. Thank you, Werner, for your time, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you. You too.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks for listening.